Hi, everyone. My name is Dantè DiSabatino. I'm joining from Seattle, Washington. I was part of a project that was a recipient of round one for the Community Catalyst initiative. And also I'll be presenting a little bit today about how we used asset mapping with climate action and youth involvement. So I was a community liaison for Woodland Park Zoo, and we were recipients of the IMLS grant for cohort one. It was really exciting to be a part of that process. And basically our group's concern was how can we mobilize climate action and engage youth in that climate action and connect them to resources from different nonprofits, institutions, and other groups that are within the city of Seattle. So, and also I apologize, I had to step away for a second. I won't have to on the phone, on the call today. But I am actually currently working in the Office of Emergency Management in Seattle, and things are getting a little busy with this virus that's been going around. People are asking a lot of questions about it. But yeah, so that's just a little bit about me. And I'm really excited to talk about this tool of asset mapping. It was something that was, I would say, transformational for our project in cohort one. So yeah, we'll go on to slide 2. Great. So let me tell you a little bit about what SYCAN is. It stands for the Seattle Youth Climate Action Network. And one of the things that we were really trying to take initiative on doing was connecting this group of professionals, nonprofits across a lot of different sectors and help connect their resources to students that wanted to take action on climate change. So these are some of the groups that were in the room. We had it was interesting in our project, we kind of had two communities. One community of these adults and people that were working in the sphere around climate action or had questions related to how to propel it. And then we had a group of students that we worked with much closely. So some of the key community connectors we had represented University of Washington Climate Impacts Group, King County Department of Natural Resources and Parks looking at climate action and justice. But it was a really exciting opportunity. Now, we used the pictures that you see here are actually from our first iteration of doing asset mapping with this group of folks. And our goal was to really figure out what can we do and what is possible to take action on climate change. So Ron actually helped us. You'll see him in the orange on the left picture there, helping us facilitate. I want you to take a look at this photo and look at some of the things that brought people together. One, we had food. We had a lot of food. We invited, yes, we had a lot of food. We actually created, we used a community asset that was owned by Seattle Aquarium to have this meeting space to start this conversation of what's possible. And this was the beginning of a second year of our project for students to get involved. So this was used as an event to get people excited, get people started, and to figure out what could be possible. But I took a couple of notes here just as Ron was talking too. We had a place, we had specific invitations that were sent, we had food, we brought other people on via social media. So we actually used Zoom. If you look on the television screen, we had people join that way. So we made it a very accessible space, a time that worked for people, and it was just a really exciting time. We'll go to the next slide. So what came out of this project was this word map. We went through the room to figure out what could be possible to take action on climate change. And there was a couple important things that made this happen. One is that we helped frame the boundaries for how we're taking action on climate change within Seattle. A lot of the times when people are writing things on the different boards around the room, we wanted to make sure it was kind of around climate action. It got really easy for folks to kind of go to the side and talk about environmental issues, maybe that weren't related to climate action, but we helped frame the boundary to climate action, which was really helpful. We had these two main groups of adults and students, so the age gap was pretty different. People were coming in from different angles, but we created a space that was equal and level. Like Ron said, we had usually about 2 to 3 students for every smaller group of adults. So each group that were rotating, they were rotating together with the adults in the room and the students. It was a level playing field. That was so important for us. Everyone had the gifts to offer, and we wanted to make sure that the students knew that they had a lot of assets, just like the adults in the room did too. This really helped harness our momentum. It was really exciting to show these assets around institutions, agencies, culture stories, associations, and places and spaces, and the group got really excited. This, and I'm actually going to be happy to, one thing I forgot to mention is that I'm happy to share kind of the type list of all of these assets and organized from the adults and students that were in the room that came up with these ideas. We'll go to the next slide. So like I said, our question was looking at all of these assets. There was so much potential. There were so much areas and names and associations and people that we could turn to. The question that we asked is, what is possible? Now, what was exciting about this is that it came out in 3 different areas from the group. The group came up and themselves figured out what were the common themes that came out of all these assets. They saw that there was a huge interest in talking about climate change and climate justice with schools, that there's ways that we can amplify existing community efforts around climate change, and also that there was a lot of interest and assets in the gifts that people were bringing in the room and people that they knew in the community around climate change and art. And I'll talk a little bit more about how the asset mapping led to one of the major projects that we did, which was around climate change and art installations. With the timing that we had, climate change and the climate change and art group really formed into driving one of the major events. The students came up with a community climate art series. They immediately started reaching out to their friends, pulling from the assets, looking at the places and spaces that they came up with. Who did they need to contact and how would it be possible? And they came up with a multi-community art series, which involved creating a mural and then having the community help create it, that projected climate justice and climate art. These are some pictures from one of the first events where they invited community members to come in to kind of do a paint by number of a collaborative art piece that really showed pulling the curtain back on climate change and showing a possibility for a more resilient climate future. And I'll be happy to share that final product as well with the group. Something that we noticed in this, like I mentioned, is that this asset mapping really set the precedent for harnessing momentum, and it came with the students realizing the power that they had in such a huge topic like climate change, that they actually had some power to take action. Some of the most amazing things that happened out of this is that after these meetings happened, some of the students then identified their own smaller breakout groups. They created own smaller minor community, other communities where they collaborated with their friends immediately at the school. They reached out to their different local school clubs and groups, and then they created conversations that didn't exist before the asset mapping process. Something that I do want to mention about this, some of my biggest lessons learned from this process, just like Ron said, is follow-up is extremely important. Because this momentum was so powerful in the beginning, you want to make sure that you do follow up and you help give them the tools to continue that facilitation and momentum. Something that I wish that I did in my position was to help a little bit more with that follow-up, because once the momentum's there, but you want to make sure you keep on going with it, with communication and facilitation with that group. You want to consider timing of when this asset mapping happens. So something that was a challenge for our group was figuring out times and places to meet. just to give you a scope of where these students and these institutions and associations were located, we're talking about the whole city of Seattle. So the farthest distance between one student and another student could actually be 20 miles. So it was a large group, very widespread. So coming up with times and places to meet, what took a lot of energy to figure out where do we do this asset mapping and how do we tackle such a big topic. But this was so helpful for us in kind of reaching a final, point for catalyzing action. If we go to the next slide, I do want to talk briefly about, we actually use this tool internally as well. So when I say internally, we looked at Woodland Park Zoo. If our communities are doing so much action around this, how can we use this tool internally across our own departments to kind of catalyze the momentum? So for Woodland Park Zoo, we had a lot of different folks from different levels of from a vice president kind of level down to even, kind of volunteer kind of level for people to be involved in this process. So SYCAN, when we say SYCAN, that would be the Seattle Youth Climate Action Network. That would be me and some other coworkers that were representing, climate action interest around that. But we wanted to see how can we use this tool internally to kind of make our efforts for our community stronger. If you go to the next slide, these are some of the kind of things that we came up with. Is a kind of a similar thing. This word map was very helpful for us to see what we can do around climate action as an institution in collaboration with our community. So how can our institutional assets be leveraged also to help for the community that we were working with? So the products of this were actually also given with our community to show them some of the assets that maybe we have that we came up with in the room that we can further connect them to as well. If you go to the next slide, we also figured out what would be possible with these. The possibilities around all of the assets that we came up with helped us show that we can connect our animals to climate change, our audience to climate change, and also it can help us develop more of a strategy for how we can be engaging our communities better to linking short and long-term strategies around climate change and possibly be a leader. A lot of this work actually helped develop a foundation for how we can develop, how we were able to develop our climate change capital campaign initiative. So when we had huge fundraising goals as an institution, this actually helped catalyze momentum there as well. Now, one slide that I didn't get to put in here quite in time, but I do want to stress some of the big kind of major takeaways we had from this process. Number one, doing this with our community and also internally, it really helped us harness momentum around the topic. This is a great tool to use in the beginning of a project and to get people excited to realize the potential that they have to take on large problems like climate change, and that there is a lot of possibility. A lot of the students coming in wanted to do something, but the idea of climate change was scary. They're involved in this because what they see portrayed in the media, seeing with natural disasters and how people are being displaced, they wanted to take action, but being able to do that for them in the beginning, before this process, they just saw a lot of gap. This showed the opportunity of what they can do to move the needle. Following up is extremely important when it comes to asset mapping, and considering timing for the community to do this was also really important. Helping facilitate and frame kind of the wide net of the assets that they have, and to kind of help facilitate it down to major goals is also extremely important. And then also just realizing that this is an iterative process. It's not just a one-time, something that if I were involved in the project for a second year, I would love to redo this project and revisit it. What I will say is I did talk to the current program coordinator that's overseeing the program now, and they are in the process of starting to identify assets and begin a new year to identify what their goals are. And this was a huge a huge tool for momentum to build. On the last slide, it shows some contact information outside of myself. But if you want to figure out kind of where the project is going for 2020, the best person to reach out to would be Josiah Downey. He is the Youth and Adult Engagement Manager at Woodland Park Zoo that is overseeing SYCAN. It is still continuing, and they are really excited to continue a new year to see what's possible to take action on climate change. Of course, I'm happy to answer any questions, you know, depending on our call right now. But also, if you wanted to reach out to me, we can send that information if I wanted to provide any more sharing of information. But that's a little bit about how we used asset mapping in our community to take action on climate change. It is something that one of the proudest moments I had in the program was seeing everyone in the room working together across institutions, with different boundaries of, you know, taking down barriers of age, and even between the government and nonprofit level. It's just really exciting to see how this tool can be used. With that said, sorry, I know I kind of ramble a little bit. I can open up the floor to questions, but also I'll kind of bring it back to Ellie and Ron for the trajectory of the meeting.
So you do the asset mapping, and then there's the step that says, so what can we do with what we have to blank?
Yeah.
But at the beginning, you're going to frame the conversation in some way, right? So you're using a prescribed geographic area. In the zoo example, it was upfront that people knew that they were going to be addressing issues of climate change or climate justice. I'm assuming that was like upfront, because the people, the adults who had all been invited were all in that sector. So what's the relationship between the frame at the top, where people come in and they know already what issue they're all there for, and you know what I mean? And then like waiting.
So in that case, because the geography was so broad, we had to put some of that framing up front. And then, so we did it was almost inverse, right? So we did some of the framing up front. What are the assets in Seattle that might be useful to climate change? Just to bring it down, because we didn't have the time or capacity to do all the assets of the entire region of Seattle. And then we looked at them and said, okay, which of these, you know, do you want to use? Or what could, looking at all these, what could you do? And then the kids came up with some art, creative-based work. They came up with connecting with clubs at schools and connecting them to some of these other assets. And there was a third area, I can't remember now. Even that was narrowed down somewhat. I can't see if Dante's still there, but the SYCAN had this tradition of doing an annual youth climate summit. And when we first started talking about asset mapping, and certainly the folks before Dante came on saw asset mapping as a way to find out the resources that could be used to pull off the next successful youth climate summit. Dante and his team were willing to not be that pointed in the inquiry question, which led them to discover that the kids didn't want to do a youth climate summit. Even though there was a million assets on the wall that could have been used for that, they wanted to do some other things and have more localized, focused action. So that's sort of a long-winded answer to that. With a big geography, you do have to invert that equation a little bit.
I agree with what Ron said. It was actually a perfect representation. And that third area was try to amplify community efforts too. So yeah, it was used. We did give, in a sense, a general category, because they were already gathered. They were already a part of the work with SYCAN because they wanted to take action on climate change. So a question that they were trying to answer is, what could we do in regards to that?
Thanks. I asked just because I think that's probably similar to a lot of us in our projects where we are already working in a prescribed area or under a prescribed mission of some kind. And so whatever, so that was useful.
Yeah. And you want to be transparent about that. At the same time, as much as you can open it up as possible, the more likely it is you'll discover things you hadn't noticed before. And that's sort of one of the key contributions asset mapping often makes to a process, is helps us see what we didn't see before. That's also driven not just by the question, but by who you have in the room. So the broader and deeper your recruiting goes to that process, the better tools you get from it. I'm sorry, Dante, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a very small thing to add. Something that's worth noting, which I won't talk too much about that, but I had to deal with the development of our logic model that was informed by the community that came into the room. So a lot of those driving actions, they determined those actions already before the asset mapping happened. So they figured out what were their goals and objectives for the year, and then they used the asset mapping to help answer the objectives that they came up with and worked on with us on for their logic model.
I have to put an asterisk there because Dante and his crew actually facilitated the youth developing their logic model.
Mm-hmm.
It was pretty phenomenal.
It was
while everyone else in that cohort was running the other way, saying, trying to hide from logic models, the zoo folks took the youth and said, here's the basics of a logic model, now figure out what you want to do.
It was scary, for sure, but it was amazing. So on a side note, if anyone has any questions about that process, I'm happy to explain the good and the things that were challenging from that too.
One question, and I will own this as mine, is around strategies for mitigating what might possibly be power dynamics in an asset mapping session. And Dante, this particularly came to mind for me with how do you make sure that the youth voice is amplified in an asset mapping session, and that someone who perceives themselves as an expert or a leader doesn't dominate the conversation?
Yeah, that's actually a great point. It was something that I initially was a little bit worried about. What I will say is that there were some folks that were in the room that worked with students. So I'd say about half of our adult group worked with youth development. And those folks and myself, having been a teacher, we kind of helped use that information in our facilitation to open that space. So really thinking about folks that work with the audience that you're trying to prevent from not having that voice shared. So I really relied on, I'd say, those kind of youth development specialists to kind of open it up. We also used that, if there's a chance to, having almost a second conversation, or we called them our steering committee. It wasn't a steering committee. I'll just say these group of organizations. We kind of explained what our goals were to amplify them to be on that same level. We set the precedent coming in that we all have assets and gifts to share equally. And that was very helpful for us, very helpful framing. But I will say we did have the benefit of having a lot of the adults in the room work with youth development already. So if you can identify those folks that are a part of the group and really kind of leverage on truly their asset and their gift of being able to help facilitate, it's very helpful. We had two community connectors in particular that helped us with that conversation. One that worked with students and one that didn't, and they also helped. So
I think also we prepped the adults a little bit before and said, this is going to happen. We're going to end up in some small groups around assets, and you're going to travel with the group. And so make sure your role is to facilitate their voice.
Yes.
So with youth, we tried to get the adults to be really intentional.
One thing we noticed is that the students, in previous situations, they sometimes can be afraid to share when there's adults in the room. We did set that precedent at the beginning, we all have gifts, and yeah, so we had the prep with the adults, and then the constant, the constant reminder of what ABCD is all about.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That's really helpful.